Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's hot topic briefing on the topic of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I'm Camilla Bullock, and I am the CEO of the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And for those of you who haven't met or heard about us before, we're the leading branch organization for the payments industry in APAC. We are by members for members, and our members are anybody who moves money or support the movements of money. Our focus is policy and advocacy to enhance the payments industry with a vision of improving lives everywhere. And we are delighted to have you here tonight. And we've actually never put together an event on such a short notice, but there is an unfortunate urgency to this topic. And I think the sheer number of people who have signed up tonight is talking for itself. We had the intention of running this as an interactive event, as a workshop, which is our preferred form when we're bringing the industry together. It's so important that we're coming together and talking to each other face to face and exchanging experience and concerns. But with so many people on the line, that would have been quite difficult for us. So instead, we're going to run it as a panel session with plenty of time for questions. And also, please be interactive through the session. I've seen that you use the chat already. Please continue to do so through comment as well as asking questions or ping each other. As an industry, we're going through uncertain time, and also as global citizens, and it's more important than ever that we're coming together to collaborate. And we're going to ask as many questions as we can tonight, and those that we wouldn't reach to, we will compile in a report that we'll share afterwards. I think one of the most urgent questions that you're having, and that people have already asked me, and I know I can answer with certainty, is that the session will be recorded and we'll share it afterwards. And also, before we kick off, I would like to say thank you to Standard Chartered and Compliant Advantages for supporting and collaborating with us on this topic. We always turn to the experts to enhance the payments industry. And I'm going to hand over now and say thank you to Fanette Sain, who is on the line and is going to be the moderator of tonight. So Fanette is one ambassador at the Emerging Payments Association Asia, and she's leading our cross-border payments project. She has a long career in payments and global banking, trade finance, both at Barclays, HSBC, Santander, and JP Morgan. Fanette, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Camilla. And I'm not sure who's looking at the video, because I'm currently being blocked on the video, and the message just says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So apologies, everyone. And while you guys are fixing that, I can do on speaker first to get this through. So thank you for the introduction, Camilla. And, you know, it's really, like Camilla says, it's such an urgent matter and everyone want direction. So I will be, I guess, as moderator, I will also take up the SWIFT, which is the SWIFT one. What does being cut off from SWIFT really means, then we will go through then the other speakers. So really, SWIFT is just a communication tool globally, and they are supposedly politically neutral because they have over 200 countries. It's very difficult for them to deal with the various sanctions, especially across different countries. So just generally, SWIFT basically will have two types of messages. One are authenticated, where it is like for payments, and these will require text key between one entity to another entity within the SWIFT community. Once they set up the SWIFT test key and authenticate it, then you can start switching. Sorry, it's cutting. Anyway, and what we'll do is we'll put all the various questions together and perhaps answer them toward the end after the speakers. And I have the EPA team to help me do that. So as a communication tool, you have authenticated. This is where the payments instructions will go from entity A to entity B, and these are authenticated, and where it is a financial one. Then you have where we have an unauthenticated, and it's just a messaging tool. Anyone in the SWIFT community can communicate or choose, as long as they have a bit code, to the other community, to another entity, and that's usually what we call an unauthenticated messages of 999. And it's just an open communication. So therefore, for SWIFT, because they are now bound by the EU sanction, as well collaborated with UK, Canada, and US, they will agree to disconnect selected banks from the financial messages. Now, there are for Russia, there are 7 designated Russian entities, and the Russian-based subsidiaries of these entities, BitCode, will be disconnected effective March 12th. Now, we also know from Belarus, who's now sided and supporting Russia, they are also going to be sanctioned and they'll also be blocked. Belarus have 3 entities and their subsidiary and their related subsidiaries based in Belarus will be disconnected effective March 20th. Now, SWIFT does have this on their website, and they'll refer you to the more published EU sanctions, and it will list these entities in the documentation. So that was the message when I was trying to understand what will SWIFT do centrally. This is what they're doing. And it follows really well with sort of the speakers now of what can be done for each respective banks, fintech, corporates. Now you have to interpret it within each other and set up your own guidelines. So hence, perhaps I can start with the first speaker, Mr. Thomas Parker, who has a long career with Standard Chartered in the various roles of compliance. And he will then look through the questions of what are the implementation from an FX macro perspective and from a crypto compliance. Thomas, can I pass it on to you?
Thanks, Vinette. I've got the same issue with the video, so you'll all be spared looking, and we'll just have to listen. But thank you. Yeah, what I was going to touch upon today was twofold. So, as you said, firstly, the implications from an FX market perspective and some of the challenges and implications and actions that we've seen in that space, and then probably which is one of the hottest topics and certainly in the sort of mainstream media talked about significantly, what the implication for crypto and digital assets market is as well. So I think I'll take it in 2 parts. I'll start with the FX space. So I think the first obvious point to make is, obviously, since the sanctions and the conflict has started, both volatility and lack of liquidity in FX markets are impacted. So that's both the Russian and the Ukrainian market has been significant. The Ukrainian onshore FX market has been shut now for 14 days. So the market impact has been significant just purely from an FX trading perspective. We have begun to see some dislocation between both the deliverable market and the NDF market. And this is driven primarily really by uncertainty about, certainly at the beginning of the conflict a couple of weeks ago, what new sanctions were going to be introduced. And at that stage, they were being introduced almost on a sort of hour by hour basis, new points. And now we still have the removal of SWIFT hanging over Russia as well. So definitely the FX market disruption has been significant. That's also been exacerbated by the banks themselves that have been sanctioned. A number of the main Russian banks, for example, Sberbank, are Nostro providers and payment providers for key industry players, other banks, other payment providers, other across the industry. And that's caused a number of issues that we've seen in uncertainty in the market around settlement and processing payments through those. So the sort of 2 things that I think have taken place in the FX market in terms of the industry response. Firstly, has been a discussion around conversion of deliverable transactions into non-deliverable transactions. Instead of settling in ruble, does it help us if we settle it in US dollars instead? And is that a way of getting around some of the restrictions, not getting around as in circumventing, but from a legitimate purpose, getting around and making it simpler to be able to keep the market operational? Both ISDA and ETMA have been drafting amendments to trade documentation that would allow this conversion of deliverable into non-deliverable. It's certainly accelerated discussions across the industry that have been rumbling for a while around what is the definition of a disruption event. As you'll be aware, many FX transactions have disruption event clauses in them, and this is certainly kind of as I said, accelerated the discussions of what is that real definition of a disruption event. In this instance, it's generally been seen as an inconvertibility or non-transferability of the deliverable currency. I think the key point to note here, of course, is although the industry groups have been leading some of the discussions and helping to draft amendments, all of those negotiations are taking place bilaterally, which is, of course, a huge challenge across the industry, particularly for those firms that might have multiple exposures across different banks. The other potential challenge with this is the volatility of the underlying ruble market, in particular the MOEX fixing. And of course, there's a number of clients and counterparties, many of whom will be on the call today, who have a genuine need to be able to actually process payments in the deliverable ruble currency for genuine business reasons. So that solution of switching to non-deliverable doesn't work for everyone. The Ukrainian market has been shut for 14 days in terms of the onshore. And this will lead me on to talk about crypto, because I think the crypto piece is quite interesting in terms of an alternative method for payment when the traditional sort of market has fallen over. So just to sum up, I guess, on the FX space, I really do think what it does show is the opportunities that also exist for alternative payment providers who are quick and agile to adapt in terms of being able to keep the market functional when you see these times of disruptions. Just to briefly, before I move on to crypto, I'll touch upon other markets as well. And many of you will see, and it's not just the FX and crypto markets that's been disrupted. You know, the commodity space has seen severe disruption as well, including obviously with many of you will have seen the LME closing the nickel market in a very unprecedented move as well. So it really is causing market disruption across all of the space. So to touch very briefly on moving on to the crypto space, you know, we'll have all seen the widespread suggestions that Russians could be using crypto assets to sidestep sanctions, and it certainly caused a lot of noise and concern. I think it may have also increased the potential deterioration of relationships between certain crypto asset providers and in particular some of the centralized exchanges and regulators and governments. It's certainly accelerating the pace of regulatory change. We've seen the EU finance ministers meeting last week, talking about digital assets and crypto as a #1 priority. President Biden looking to be signing an executive order, swiftly bringing in regulation around crypto as well. I think realistically, all of the direction is exactly the same. We knew at the start of 2022 that the focus of regulators across the globe was going to be to bring more regulation into the crypto market. The events of the last few weeks and months has really just added pace and momentum to that direction. I think in reality, it is just sort of important to touch slightly a little bit in terms of the scale of the problem. You know, the Russian economy is a massive economy. The central bank reserves were sitting at 630 billion at the last estimate. Imports and exports of approximately in 2020 around 300 billion US dollars and the whole Bitcoin market. When you compare that to the whole Bitcoin market, that is also worth about 750 to 800 billion, depending on the latest valuation. The market clearly doesn't have the depth to absorb widespread use from the central bank. Could it still be used by sanctioned individuals? Yes, of course. But you also have the end point. They might be able to convert things into crypto. They might be able to convert their assets into crypto. But in order to use them effectively, they'd probably still need to convert into fiat again. And that would be where they would hit sanctions. As I know some of the people have already mentioned on the chat, it's also been interesting to see the crypto and digital asset space being used for positive, and they've remained robust when other markets have failed, for example, in Ukraine themselves. So is there the concern around proceeds of illicit activity or sanctioned entities using it to sidestep? Clearly that is something. There is a much lower association for the top tier regulated exchanges, and it does seem to be very focused on a small number of unregulated entities in high risk markets. And in terms of the regulatory direction, I think that was clear already at the start of 2022. The market might have taken a slight reputational hit in the past month or so, but overall, the direction was clear. It's just accelerated that, and it strengthens the role of regulated and well managed firms in that space. So I think that will be that's my short summary, I guess, of on the FX and crypto space. From my perspective, happy to take questions as they come in through the chat, and after the other speakers are finished, we can pass those.
Thank you, Thomas. I do see questions on the chat. Now, what I was hoping is please go ahead and put all your questions, and we have the EPAA team that will sort them through and consolidate. And as I'm also looking after, maybe I have one extra question for Thomas. Maybe we'll cover a number of these quick inquiries. Because as we said in my intro, SWIFT is only centrally blocking 7 entities and its related Russian subsidiaries based in Russia. So everything else is really subject to each of the entity itself. So if you're a large conglomerate that has you have a headquarter being in UK, you have a physical branch in China. Thomas, in terms of compliance, because you have different type of rules, right? Because now EU, US are saying we have a sanction against certain entities or certain transaction, while China doesn't have it. And who should they follow? If you're physically located in China, would you be, in non-compliance if you don't allow some of these transactions, and vice versa, because your head office is in one of the sanctioned countries? How would you deal with that?
Obviously, a situation that we're finding ourselves as an entity in at the moment. I think what it's important to know is, the sanctions that have been introduced by the US, UK, and EU are legal obligations. So if you are operating in those markets, you have a full legal obligation to make sure you're compliant with those sanctions. Certainly from the bank's perspective, Standard Chartered's perspective, we will be complying across the globe in terms with all of our entities with those sanctions. It does, I think it's a valid question and consideration. It's really a decision from a risk-based perspective for each entity to take in terms of where their operations are. But I would emphasize the point that they're very legal obligations. They are law. So you do risk being seen as non-compliant with the law if you take part even in a different entity outside of the UK, US, or EU.
Thank you, Thomas. Again, please continue with your questions, and we'll continue with the next subject. And we'll fall back after we finish with the other speakers. So moving along, our next speaker is Ross Knapp, also with Standard Chartered Bank, and he has a slew of resume on cyber threat. And cybersecurity, sorry. Can I hand it on to Ross?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, depending on where you are. What are the cyber implications of the conflict? So I guess the first thing to say is I could talk about this for hours, so I'll do my best to distill the key points down into these 5 minutes that we have. So the first thing to say is that there has been a dramatic escalation of cyber attack activity in recent weeks. And this can really be split into 2 categories: nation state driven cyber attacks, and then so-called patriotic hacking activity. And that side of things is where normal citizens decide to conduct retaliatory hacking. And the vast majority of what we're seeing at the moment falls into this latter camp, so-called patriotic or hacktivist cyber attacks. So generally speaking, the hacktivist attacks are relatively unsophisticated. So low-level denial of service attacks where websites are overloaded by large volumes of data being sent to it, or website defacement. So a website's content is altered to display some sort of political message. And in these cases, really, these hacktivists are exploiting known vulnerabilities for which patches have existed for many months in most cases. So as usual, one of the best defenses for an organization remains an efficient vulnerability management program in your organization and patching rapidly. And looking at the nation state side of things, one of the most frequent questions I'm really asked at the moment is, do we need to be concerned about another NotPetya style attack? So many of you will recall that NotPetya was a destructive malware attack that targeted Ukraine back in 2017 but the attack quickly spread outside of Ukraine and across the world, causing massive impacts to organizations globally. So will we see that again? My assessment at the moment is that remains unlikely. The first thing to say is that NotPetya was very unique in that the malware had incorporated capability that was stolen from the US National Security Agency, the NSA. And it was that NSA capability called Eternal Blue that allowed that malware to spread across the world in a very uncontrolled fashion. And actually, that resulted in NATO clarifying its position on cyber attacks, with NATO Secretary Hans Stoltenberg, who of course we've been seeing a lot of at the moment, saying that a cyber attack from a nation state on a NATO country could be enough to trigger NATO's Article 5 mutual defense commitment. So for those reasons, I think it's unlikely, and attacks will remain focused on the main theatre of operations, Ukraine. And the main nation state threat to everyone at this stage is really from collateral attacks. So, for example, a Ukraine government website could be compromised and used as what we call a watering hole. And that's where the website has been compromised with the sole purpose of compromising other entities. So other Ukrainian entities might use that website as part of their business, and by accessing the website, they become compromised. And so you may access the website in the course of your research or business engagements and could inadvertently become a victim, even though you weren't the intended target. So looking back at the hacktivist threat, we are seeing this play out on both sides of the conflict. So, for example, the ransomware group known as Conti announced their full support of the Russian government, saying that if anybody decides to organize a cyber attack or any war activities against Russia, they would use all of their resources to strike back at the critical infrastructure of the enemy. So within a few days of Conti making that announcement, Conti themselves were attacked by activists who then leaked all of their data, private communications, source code of their ransomware tools. So it's really, I guess you could say, a little bit of karma right there. So hacktivists may choose to target companies that are perceived to be damaging Russia. So brands who have shut down or paused operations could become direct targets of hacktivist activity. But again, in general, this is relatively unsophisticated, relying on DDoS and exploitation of known vulnerabilities. I see now we've finally got the video working. Excellent. So the final thing really to say is that there are likely to be some profound changes to the longer-term cyber threat landscape. The sanctions placed on Russia are, of course, severe, drastically limiting access to markets and technology. Things that we take for granted, like our iPhones, are no longer available for purchase in Russia. So I think we'll see a retooling of cyber operations and capability, where we'll see a move towards highly targeted and covert acquisition of confidential material and intellectual property to effectively replicate some of these industries. So to summarize then, at the moment, much of what we're seeing is confined to the battlefield. There are signs this is starting to spill over into other areas and verticals, but the activity remains relatively unsophisticated. And as long as you have a reasonably mature cybersecurity program, then you do remain well protected against the current threats that we're seeing. And longer term, we need to prepare for much more sophisticated and targeted attacks, more aligned to things like economic and corporate espionage. So that was a couple of hours content distilled into 5 minutes. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Ross. That was very interesting. Especially, I love your example of Conti, how they supported Russia. Now, vice versa, because we do know Ukraine was hit also, right, from Russia. How will this play out? I mean, is there any? I see there's one question about, and you did touch base on that. Is that if it's a national country itself supporting these cyber attacks? How do you see this play out? Would it then become country versus country?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, we are seeing, Ukraine themselves are being hit with destructive malware, so wiper malware. They are being targeted. The Ukrainians themselves have said that they are repelling these attacks on a daily basis. Destructive attacks are not new. Most major powers retain capabilities that allow them to extend the battlefield to cyber, and NATO, for example, is very open that cyber is one of the dimensions of warfare that they are prepared for. So I think we'll continue to see these strikes on really both sides, albeit more Russia targeting Ukraine just because of the stronger capability in Russia. And then I think we are seeing that spill out into other areas. But predominantly right now, the main threat to all of us really is stemming from this hacktivist group, so non-nation state. As I mentioned earlier, in some respects, nation state attacks are limited because of NATO's view of cyber attacks and what they mean in terms of Article 5. But of course, that doesn't come into the consideration for hacktivists or your general citizens who are hacking for patriotic purposes, who are not so concerned with those ramifications. So, anyone on this call who, for example, is suspending operations in Russia or pulling staff out of Russia could be perceived to be, anti-Russia and therefore a legitimate target. And so that's really more what you're likely to see from that hacktivist side of things. But as I said, that activity is relatively unsophisticated. It's DDoS attacks, and it's really targeting vulnerabilities that have been well known about, and those patches exist. So as long as they're applied in your organization, you're protected from that activity.
Thank you, Ross. And I see there's a continuing questions on, USA, SWIFT payments, including CBDC. But let me move on to our third speaker, Chris Dingling-Pohl, who's with Comply Advantage. Now, quick brief of the company is an AI-driven financial crime report and detecting technology. And Chris, you'll be working on the questions of what is the most asked question by the fintechs, and what should they focus on? What should they not focus on?
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's some great speeches from Ross, Thomas, and everyone else on the panel. So a super timely topic. Whilst we've been on the call, a very famous person called Roman Abramovich has been sanctioned by the UK government. Lots of you will have been to Chelsea football matches. So the big question by everyone on the call today will be, can I still buy tickets for the next Chelsea match? And the answer is yes, you can buy tickets for the next Chelsea match. So the government explicitly said that's still allowed. So obviously, the past 2 weeks has been a huge watershed in sanctions. My mum didn't really know what I did beforehand, but now she does. I think there's never been a time really when sanctions have been more front and center. But I think the Roman Abramovich example is quite interesting to kind of dig into the various different dimensions of that. Am I able to share my screen at all, or? So what we have here is the profile of Roman Abramovich on Comply Advantage, basically. And so you can see that if, say, you're making payments to Roman Abramovich, it isn't just Roman Abramovich himself that's the issue. It's also all of his children, his nieces, his nephews, his business partners. And so it's actually very challenging to make sure the money isn't going directly to Abramovich. Also, you can see that Abramovich has been a well-known person for a long time. So previously, he was the governor of the Chukotka Autonomous Okrug in Far Eastern Siberia. So if you were screening already for politically exposed persons, then you would have known that Abramovich was a high-risk person. And also, even before he became politically exposed, you would have seen that he would have been in Abbas media. So lots of press in, say, French or Arabic would have picked up that he was linked to lots of high-profile people. And therefore, really, we should have known that he was high risk. And probably, if he was putting lots of money through your fintech, or his niece was, then probably you should have been aware of that issue. So we know that Putin puts millions of dollars through, say, his friend's daughter. So a ballerina in the States, ballet, had $20 million. So that was already a huge risk. So I think also in terms of the range of issues that came out today, that there was a person called Alexei Mordashov who was sanctioned as well. So we can see that this person here is sanctioned. I think also the issue with Alexei Mordashov is that there are various spellings of Alexei, and therefore it's very important to have the right spelling, because it could be that you're spelling it a different way. And so you need to have the right fuzziness, the right Cyrillic name matching technologies. But aside from that, so we've been really deluged with questions in the past few days about the different sanctions that have gone on and what fintech should do. So what we did was we compiled a chart. So we published this chart last week showing how rapidly changing all the different jurisdictions are. And you can see that the EU sanctioned all the members of the Russian State Duma that voted for the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk. And so the EU then sanctioned everyone. UK didn't. UK sanctioned very few people, and therefore the government were attacked by the opposition. And that's why they've sanctioned Abramovich today. So there are all kinds of questions, not just about that, but also say, if you're making payments, you saw that the 7 Russian banks were disconnected from SWIFT, but also all their BIC codes were sanctioned as well. So as the other panelists eloquently stated, it isn't just a payment mechanism, SWIFT. It's more of a messaging system. So you can still make payments via the phone and update ledgers. So really, you have to screen for the different banks, different payment mechanisms, and really be aware of all those issues. So really, you've had tons of questions, because the first question that any fintech CEO will ask is go straight to their head of compliance and ask them all these questions. So all these questions there, which we can go into specifically on the responses around SWIFT. In terms of other questions that we're having, what we recognized, or at least what we're recommending, is really to have the right systems and controls in place. So even before things got complex, fintechs like BitPay were fined by the Office of Foreign Assets of Control for sending money to Crimea. Other companies around the world have been sanctioned as well for the same issue. And that was when things were easy and straightforward, because it was an obvious geographical area after the 2014 invasion. Now, if you're sending money to Irpin or money to crypto addresses from the Ukrainian social media account, or you're responding to charity campaigns, it's a minefield. So if fintechs were being fined when it was easy, imagine how big the fines will be when it's straightforward, right? I think there are various other questions that we can go into in terms of what are the correct procedures and training and exposure, and which entity should I really be doing business with. I think what we've seen in the past 2 weeks is virtually every business exit Russia, and that's more implicit cultural sanctions in terms of people just are so horrified that there's been a natural reaction, and that's not necessarily a kind of legal requirement. That's more people just are so revolted by Putin's actions. But range of other questions that we've had to answer. So we're processing roughly 4,000 searches or transactions per second. We have 2,000 companies that have asked us, hey, what should we be doing? So we've been working overtime, not only to kind of keep data up to date and keep track of all the different movements and press releases and the government saying they've sanctioned someone but actually haven't, but also kind of all different questions around political exposure and relative close associates, SWIFT access, cryptocurrencies. So yeah, tons of questions there, which I'm happy to kind of answer based upon the Q&A we're getting in the amazing chat channel we have here. We haven't had a question in the Q&A section during the past 2 minutes that I've been speaking, but if someone wants to ask me a question, I will answer a question. Chrissy has asked, what of all the US actions? It seems to be pro-war leaders aren't being sanctioned in the same manner. So I think if you look at the UN General Assembly, you had 5 countries that voted in favor of Russia. So the UN's only sanctioned one entity because Russia has a veto on the Security Council. In the General Assembly, it doesn't, and therefore Eritrea, I think North Korea, Syria, maybe Venezuela voted for Russia, or at least against the motion. I think 15 countries voted to abstain, including South Africa and China and some other countries that bordered Russia, but the vast majority of countries around the world voted in favor of the motion. So yeah, are you publishing sanctions information via APIs? Is there any sanctions information published to oracles on the Ethereum blockchain? So everything we do is via the API. So we have 200 million clients uploaded directly into the system, and every day we're pinging updates saying, hey, these 5 clients are now sanctioned, asset freeze, travel ban, you freeze the accounts. We work with many companies who are linked to the Bitcoin and Ethereum ecosystem, like say Binance, eToro, Paxos. So yeah, I think all those companies get it via the API. We're not publishing directly to a blockchain. With FATCA, the US was able to push the legislation to other countries. Will we see the same action with these national level sanctions? I think what you've seen is Japan has kind of echoed the work that Putin did, preparing the ground for the invasion by stating that the islands, the kind of Kuril islands that were taken in World War II by Russia in the dying days, are now Japanese territory. So they have now published their own sanctions against Russia. They already had sanctions regimes that were in place. So yeah, I think as you saw from the chart we published, it is a very broad-based effort with most Western countries, including Japan, have published sanctions against Russia.
Thank you, Charles. You followed up in one of the questions I was going to ask you, but I think right now we'll go ahead and collect the continuing question, but let me hand it over to Camilla. We have a polling question, and based on maybe the number of the percentage coming out, we can see where we want to go with the priority of the questions. So you can see the polling in. Go ahead, Camilla.
Yeah, I was going to say it's been an excellent conversation so far. So let's see what the audience, their biggest concerns is. So it's actually, you can just click one of those so we can get a bit fluctuation, what is in the top of everybody's mind. And then I'll hand back to you, Finette, and we can get the panelists, Ross, Thomas, and Charles, to answer a little bit on the same questions. So also to see if they sometimes might have different perspective on what's coming up. Good, it's still some answers coming in. And thank you to all audience and everybody to hanging on when the videos weren't on. I think it adds an extra dimension. There we go.
Yep. Are you able to share the poll results? Right.
Yes.
Excellent. So compliance, Thomas, you're in the hot seat as usual with the regulated trails. So I have picked up a couple of questions, and I don't know if there's any other on there which I thought was quite interesting and perhaps we can answer. I think one of them, I can start first with, we talked about the physical access to the SWIFT network, and it goes, how does SWIFT mitigates these risks for the Russian banks? Did you want to take that, Thomas, or I can update a little bit from a SWIFT side?
Yeah, well, why don't I start from the industry side, and then you supplement Finette from the SWIFT side. I was unable to vote. I was desperately trying to vote for cybersecurity to get the spotlight on Ross, but I was blocked from voting. But that's fine. No, I think the key point that's been mentioned really around the SWIFT piece that I would emphasize is the proposed action is only targeting a small number of Russian banks. So it's not saying we're completely removing ruble. It's not saying we're completely removing all Russian entities from the SWIFT network. It is targeting a small but significant proportion of Russian banks who handle those payments. So it doesn't mean that we won't be able, and firms won't be able to process payments through the SWIFT network into Russia and in ruble and to Russian entities, but it will make it, kind of as I touched upon in my sort of opening remarks, it makes it more difficult because of a number of the firms that the most industry players use for those payments may well be on the sanctions list. So it might be that they have to look at alternative providers or other entities that are able to help process those payments on the SWIFT network. That's kind of the overall SWIFT sort of point from me in the sense of it doesn't make it impossible. It just restricts it and makes it more difficult for people with a genuine need, and they might need to change their provider, clearly, if one of their providers is one of those sanctioned banks. But no, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add on that.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, so from the SWIFT side, again, because they're supposed to be politically neutral, it is very difficult where one country is sanctioning or a group of countries is sanctioning certain entities. I mean, for example, US recently says we're going to even ban oil. So now you can't purchase. So then from a US perspective, you cannot deal with payments to any of these oil companies, et cetera. However, EU hasn't support that sanction. So therefore, from a SWIFT side, they can't do anything other than those 7 entities that they will remove their BIC code. So a lot of people are worried about, the SWIFT, what will SWIFT do? That's all they can do. Then, as Thomas mentioned, now it's up to each of the individual entity having to face, all right, what will happen? Will my payment be impacted? And I would probably suggest you go with your current, your funding the current way. And if it's to your bank, you need to understand sort of your bank's policy. How are they dealing with, and which entity are they having to be complying with? Because what I would find is that my question earlier was, if you have a head office in one of the sanctioned area and you're physically in another area that is not sanctioned, you might get penalized from either, right? It's a legal requirement from your headquarters you need to follow, but then you might be penalized when you're in the country that doesn't have the sanction. So we talked about how PayPal, MasterCard, Visa has now, removed sort of the access within Russia. However, UnionPay is open. So then if your bank has a relationship through China, it could then also make that payment through the UnionPay instead. So that's why it is very big in terms of the question, right? I have another one, which I thought was great, where it talk about the exporter. Right? You already shipped the goods to Russia, and you're waiting for, is it the LC, et cetera, to complete before the payment's received? And will your bank stop that payment? So these are where you need to reach out to your specific bank or fintech provider to see what are the timing, what are the dates. And I must admit, speaking to a lot of my friends and colleagues in the financial industry, they even find they have to make certain decision within the location because there's maybe not a global standard that's being published within their bank as well. So this is why it's very much a mixed bag. I can see Thomas shaking his head on that comment as well of that. Let's see, I'm looking at some other questions because I do have some for Charles later. So it says here, if China introduces their CBDC into the Russian market, will the banks be able to monitor transactions as it will not come through SWIFT? We did have a CBDC discussion in many of our EPA seminars and workshops. So CBDC really is within each of the specific country at this time. So for example, yes, China has introduced the CBDC. Will Russia, or does Russia have existing CBDC already? I'm actually not aware, but you have some other countries that eventually will want to connect, and they're in pilot. So if they do go through, even with the CBDC, it really depends on how each CBDC is communicating with each other. If they are purely using a non-SWIFT network, then that will be the case. But if they are still using the SWIFT network, and I have some example, if not CBDC, of real-time growth settlement system, you have countries networking within each other, and they would use the SWIFT network as well. So it's really depending on each of the country and their underlying method that they're using and the newest development, which is CBDC, and a lot of countries are opening that. Is there any other questions? If someone needs to flag to me. The first few questions is about Central Asian countries. Again, if you're in Central Asia, not related to US, EU, then it's really, are your party neutral? If it's neutral, SWIFT won't stop any of these other, all the other entities in the code, so it should still be working. And again, it's all the legal specific entities. Let me know if there's any other question, or Camila, Nikeshi, you can kind of jump in if there's any other questions. I do have, I was quite impressed with Charles. You were talking about the related entities, especially the newer subject would be, like you said, the oligarchs, right? So you put out the first person, which is great. And as you're tracking more and more, how will, other than the companies knowing it, is there a common directory available to show the relationship, including, like you said, daughter, subsidiary, trust that these oligarchs?
So we have we basically build and kind of maintain all our data basically. So like if you search for like a name, then it will tell you if that person is related to an oligarch.
As far as I know, its highest level was currently there's a number of oligarchs, but I haven't heard, like they have published a list, and if it's all countries agreeing to which list of the oligarchs.
Also, what we're doing is looking at all the adverse media in Cyrillic. So if there's a mention in like a kind of Siberian newspaper about someone being linked to corruption or bribery, or if they're politically exposed. So what we're mapping is everyone that's high risk in Russia. And then doing the name transliteration from Cyrillic into other languages. So all you need to do is search the name in the database, and it will tell you if that name is high risk.
Thank you, Charles, because I know working in different banks before, not subject to how each of the legal entity know their own, KYC, know their clients. I had a previous role where you have to understand the relationship, the percentage of ownership. And again, every financial institution, fintech, may have their own definition. And it's having that consistency is a challenge.
Yeah, so there's compliance with the OFAC 50% rule and subsidiaries, minorities. And yeah, so Sovcom Bank has 50 different subsidiaries around the world. So you track all of those as well. And we have that database all linked together.
Yeah, and especially I think for the attendees, it's very difficult, especially where they have not a direct family like daughter. Like how about their brothers, sisters, their trust? All these need to be interpreted like, or would they be sanctioned as well?
I think Putin's violinist, his favorite violinist, is worth like $100 million. He must be a very good violinist to make $100 million from playing the violin.
I see a few other questions, so let's see. So we talk about, please zoom into the sanction. It depends on which sanction list you're referring to. So there's multiple info, and I think I'm not sure if Charles is able to provide a link to what you were showing in there. And I know we will provide, or we have in the chat room, the list of the SWIFT link to the what SWIFT provided, and that also shows the 7 entities. And it will provide you more links to their entities, subsidiaries, etc. Are U.S. company exposed to secondary sanction if import Russian oil to non-oil jurisdiction and make payment in euro?
I can maybe. Sorry, was that a question? Was I jumping in the middle now?
I was just going to refer if Tom want to comment on that.
I would say no, they can't. I think as part of the sanctions, like if you have like a kind of correspondent Nostro-Vostro account, then you have to close that too. And that's a key mechanism through which the Russian banks are being excluded from the from the global payment system. So yeah, I think absolutely you have to close that.
And again, if you're a non-US company, because the sanction is on US companies, right, or from the US. So again, is very subject to the interpretation. In your situation, are you related at all to any US entities, right? If it's not headquarter, branch, etc. Because that's where the definition will come in. if you're, if you need to or not. But if you're trying to do it via Euro or other through other jurisdictions, but you need to comply with the US, then absolutely, Charles, correct, you cannot. Can financial institution maintain a ruble account with sanctioned Russian bank?
I was just going to add something on that. What I would say is,
Perfect.
We have seen the extraterritorial nature, particularly of the US authorities, but also other authorities as well. But, in the sense of, it doesn't take much of a nexus for them to be pretty significant in any enforcement action. So I really would, emphasize to look at these measures very carefully, and relying on kind of individual. We're not. We don't have a basis in the EU, or we don't have a touch point to the UK. It is quite a risky strategy to be taking. Clearly people will know their own legal entity setups and things like that, but it's we do know that both the authorities in the US and the EU are quite happy to take any type of extraterritorial nature, and obviously the world's currency does remain dollars, which is the US dollar, so that kind of almost gives everyone a potential US name and US nexus anyway. So I think it can be quite tricky to kind of withdraw that definition. I don't know whether that's other thoughts on that as well, but that would be my thought.
Thank you, Raf. I think also from the, go ahead, Camille.
Yeah, maybe we could continue for a long time. It's lots of great content here and lots of great questions. I'd just like to jump in with one last question to all the participants, including Ufinet, and that is, during this conversation today, is it any question you can think of that hasn't been asked? Is it something you're surprised is lacking in the conversation? I know that's not the easiest one, so I'll let you think a few seconds about that. And then also, what would you like to see happen? Is it something that you're waiting to see that could be really good for our industry if action would be taken together? So Ross, you'll be the lucky one to go first on this one.
Sorry, you cut out a bit there. Could you just repeat that for me?
What is it? Any questions you think are missing today? Is it any question that hasn't been asked? And what would you like to see happening, like as a collaboration across the industry to prepare ourselves or better the situation?
Yeah, so there was a great question raised by Andrew in the chat, which I had just replied to, in fact, which was about SWIFT itself and the security of SWIFT, and does Russia have some pre-positioned capability inside SWIFT? My assessment on that is highly unlikely. Based on what we saw in Ukraine, we didn't see immediate outages to Ukrainian national infrastructure. There was no indication of any pre-positioned capability in Ukraine to just sort of turn off their networks. And that was a well-planned conflict, and that capability still didn't exist in that scenario. So I think that is very unlikely. I think really it's reiterating things like best practice in organizations right now, just following some of the sort of core basics, which are unfortunately very easily forgotten with other priorities taking place, is maintaining a very robust cybersecurity posture, remembering that anyone here could be a target. You could receive that phishing email that's very convincing and click that link. And just to remember, it's very easy to forget when we're caught up in our days to just sort of click on something and then realize what we've done. So my biggest bit of advice is slow down where possible. When you're looking at emails, slow down, resist that urge to just kind of click through and be extra vigilant in these times.
Thank you. I think that's one that can't be said enough, the human link in all those situations. Thomas, would you like to answer the same question?
I guess the question that I'm surprised hasn't been focused on more, maybe it has in the chat and I've missed it, but I guess naturally we've focused a lot on the sanctions and the impact of business with Russia. We haven't touched so much upon the impact from a Ukraine perspective, and how as an industry can we send funds into Ukraine if that's what they're looking to do and continue to support businesses or charities on the ground in Ukraine, if that's the view that people want to take. And actually, I think that's where the industry, particularly the fintech industry, whether it's the digital asset space or even just traditional fintech, is a really important role, given the sort of current closure of the onshore FX market, the closure of traditional banking routes into Ukraine. I think that's somewhere where this industry group really can step up and actually provide support and access into that country and network where the more traditional payment methods might have fallen over. So that was something that I thought might come up today, and in answer to your question, I guess that was why I was surprised that hasn't, but maybe it has on the chat. But
I think it was raised again. Are there sufficient controls to ensure that sanctions are followed in the crypto world? Came in there. Good. Charles, is it any question that you feel hasn't come up? That you have got a lot of questions during the last week, I assume, but is it something that you feel hasn't been covered?
I guess the most interesting one is probably what will happen in 5 years' time, and will sanctions be undermined by things like crypto or CBDs? I think I think my answer to that would probably be that in the end, if there's concerted action against the country, it doesn't matter what technology there is, because I think in the end, governments will ban or restrict those payment flows. So I think it is an arms race. It's constantly challenging. It's always more complex. So I think that makes the job of everyone on this call more and more exciting and more challenging as time goes on. So you need the best partners, the best tools, and the best people to help you comply with those things.
Yeah, I think that's one of the we have talked a lot about internally over the last week. That what does this mean for alternative rails, and how will the world look? How many times have we said the new normal over the last 3 years? Yeah. But like, how will it look when tomorrow comes around? Finette, you led this whole thing and you heard lots of questions. Is it anything you surprised that hasn't come up today?
Not much, but I'm seeing a lot of the questions, and I could see there's like two type of questions. One is from the actual client. If you're having a payment questions, etc., against the sanction, will I get my payment? So at the actual end client, I would say go and look at your payment provider. They will know if your particular concern will be sanctioned or addressed. The other group of questions I see are sanction list. Who are they? Will it work? Will it impact me or which countries? Then this is a more complex one, because it's really subject to where are your client? What are their sanction lists? And each country has its own sanction. I'm seeing through the chats as well, right? Australia, their own. China may have their own or not. So I think there's that two flavor there. I think one thing that hasn't been discussed as much is, and I can't remember who was saying, the dollar's the main currency. I'm afraid, is this an opportunity where, we did create Union Pay, right? China had Union Pay within their own domestic, originally created to be not reliant on MasterCard, Visa, which is US based. I know previously we have on the wholesale side, we have a continuous link settlement, which is owned by multiple banks for real time, for settlement across currency. And China has built its own, again, to take out the dependency. So with now the sanction between, China not putting any sanction on Russia, will then the ways and method of payments be moved out of US and EU method and SWIFT even. I think that will probably have a lot more.
Thank you all, to all panelists and all the audience. And what we will do is we'll go through, we'll do a transcript, we'll find the questions, and we'll compile a report on this so you can go back to. And also our aim is always to build on the conversation. So this is not something we've done standalone. We'll take this and see what needs to come back. And we promised you work breakout rooms. We'll bring you some breakout rooms in one of the future events. But today, thank you very, very much, everybody, for joining in and sharing the question, because it's just hearing the industry's voice that we know how we can help and assist to enhance payments in the region. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon again.